Today we're going to talk about how we retrieve memories, whether memories are implicit or explicit, meaning whether they don't require our conscious awareness or they do require our conscious awareness in order to retrieve them. Successful retrieval depends on how they were encoded and how they're cued. So I want you to think about what is different about these two tasks in front of you. If I were to have you type out every red pepper is tantalizing versus if I were to have you recall which 10 letters appear in the top row of the keyboard. The difference is that just simply typing, likely at this point in your life, is not requiring a whole lot of conscious awareness in order to do it. You just kind of do it. It's a procedural memory. Whereas having to think about the top row of the keyboard, that requires some conscious thought. You actually have to think about it. And this is really the difference between an implicit versus explicit memory. Typing, implicit. Recalling those 10 letters, explicit. So I want you to think back to when we talked about our dual track mind, how we have that low road or the automatic road or the unconscious road, and then the high road that runs through the cerebral cortex, where all of our higher order thinking and conscious awareness takes place. Think about that here as we start talking about implicit versus explicit memories. An implicit memory requires automatic processing, so think about that being like what happens on the low road. These are memories that either were not deliberately learned or that they're things that you perform that you don't have any conscious awareness of, or things you really think or retrieve that you don't really have much conscious awareness of as you're retrieving them. Even though we might not be consciously aware of these actions, they can very much influence our behavior or our mental processes. And these are just some examples of implicit memories or procedural memories. I think for our purposes, you can think of implicit memory and procedural memory as being synonymous, meaning they basically mean the same thing. Some structures in the brain that are important when we're talking about procedural or implicit memories are the cerebellum. This is the storehouse for some of our implicit, especially our procedural memory, like riding a bike and brushing our teeth and all those things, and any kind of muscle memory. And then this other really important part called the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is like your brain's autopilot. It's what makes us such creatures of habit. You hear terrible, terrible stories about how parents leave their children in hot cars. And, you see terrible comments online after something like that happens. But the reality is, if you were to look at any neuroscience article about this, it could happen to anyone. Because, again, our brains are such creatures of habit. There's so much based around routine that if a parent breaks routine, it would be very easy for them to forget something that's out of that particular routine. So the basal ganglia is responsible for that autopilot for procedural memory. It receives information from this higher order thinking cerebral cortex, but doesn't send information back to the cortex to enable our conscious awareness. Explicit memories, unlike implicit memories, require what is called effortful processing. So we need to put forth effort in order to store and to retrieve these memories. Memory that has been processed with attention and can be consciously recalled would be considered explicit. So anything you do in class, when you're sitting down and you're taking a test and you have to think hard about what an answer is, that's an example of explicit memory. The way that our memory works, or the way that we retrieve memories, is largely by using what we call retrieval cues. And I like to think of retrieval cues as like search terms. If I were to type a search term into the search bar in Google, it would give me a whole lot of information, right? So any kind of a stimulus, like a smell, a visual cue, like a question on a test, a sound, any of these stimuli can act as retrieval cues and enable us to retrieve memories. It's what activates our declarative memory. These retrieval cues activate our declarative memory. Priming is a technique for retrieving implicit memories. If you think all the way back to the beginning of the year when we did our irrational game and we talked about the individuals that were asked to write out the 10 Commandments before they were given the opportunity to cheat, researchers found that those that have written out the 10 Commandments were less likely to cheat than their control group. And that's because researchers think they were primed. That simple act of writing out the 10 Commandments influenced their behavior later on, even if they weren't consciously aware of the fact that having that reminder of morality was making them less likely to cheat when they were given the opportunity to. And this duck rabbit is just another example of priming. I'm not going to spend too much time because we did talk about it in sensation and perception. When it comes to retrieving explicit memories, like what you're trying to do when you're sitting down and answering questions on a test, that requires our conscious awareness. If you remember, we said everything in long-term memory is filed away according to meaning. I like to think of long-term memory as being like a filing cabinet. So anything stored in long-term memory must be filed according to its pattern or its meaning. And think about what is the best way we said you can file information away according to its meaning. What's the strategy we use? It's called elaborative rehearsal or elaboration. That's when we're taking information and we're making it meaningful by connecting it to things that we already know, that's already in memory. Here's 2 little exercises in memory retrieval. I want you to see if you can write down the names of all 7 dwarfs. So pause the video, try to write the names of all 7 dwarfs. You might have found it difficult to list them all, but how about now? Can you pick out all 7 now? Try it. Pause the video. Chances are that you had an easier time with the second task than the first task, because in the first test, I asked you to recall, whereas in this second task, you just had to recognize. So that's a difference between what we call recall and recognition. They're different retrieval tasks. One may be easier than another in certain circumstances. If you've ever taken an essay test, which of course you have, then you know what it's like to have to recall. When you recall, you have to actually reproduce previously learned information that might not be in your conscious awareness, whereas recognition just involves you identifying items that you've previously learned, like when you're taking a multiple choice test. When you're taking a multiple choice test, you don't have to completely recall all the information. The answer's in front of you. You just have to be able to recognize what it is. Relearning means that we learn more quickly when we learn something a second time or a later time. So for example, I've taught you priming at several points throughout the course of the year. It should be easier for you to learn it now in the context of retrieving implicit memories than it was the first time that you learned it. Your retrieval should be easier now that you've learned it several times. Other factors that can affect retrieval include what we call context-dependent memory. Context is so important when it comes to memory. When I go out to the store, if I ever go to the Target over here in Abington, I always run into a whole bunch of former students, right? It might be more difficult for me to remember their names when I'm in that setting versus if they were to show up at the high school one day, because that context is missing when I'm out at a store versus when I'm in school where I knew the person. The encoding specificity principle says that the more closely retrieval cues match the form in which information was encoded, the better the information will be remembered. What does that mean? It means that ideally, the place where you should take the AP Psychology exam is in the room where we learned AP Psychology. Conditions under which the information was encoded are also the best conditions for retrieving the information. Now, even though you might not be taking the test in that room, overlearning can help you overcome this disadvantage. So remember from the beginning of the year, overlearning is when you have learned something so well that it becomes second nature and it requires much less effort in order to retrieve the information. Mood can also influence memory. State-dependent memory, mood-congruent memory. We've all been in a situation where we're in an incredibly bad mood. Maybe we're very, very sad, and all of a sudden, really sad memories all start flooding back to us all at once. Similarly, if we're happy, research shows that we're more likely to retrieve happy memories. So mood can also influence memory retrieval. And then something that we've all experienced, the tip of the tongue or the tot phenomenon. This is when we maybe are asked a question and we know exactly what we want to say, but we just can't quite come out with the word. It's on the tip of our tongue, but we're not able to recall it. It usually does come to us later on.